President.
Senator from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask the quorum call be vitiated,
Without objection.
and I ask the President to let me know when I've finished, when I've used 10 minutes.
Chair will do so.
Thank you. Mr. President, last week we Republican senators had an extraordinary experience that millions of Americans have had and will have in the future. We spent a day at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, which is not more than about 40 minutes from the nation's capital. Even in the middle of winter, it's a beautiful, historic setting. It's hard to imagine why George Washington and Martha Washington would ever want to leave the place. Touring the rooms, we could imagine what life must have been like then. And there were many things that impressed us and that impress any of us when we visit there. One thing that especially impressed me was the fact that despite the beauty of the place and Washington's love for farming, he was gone from Mount Vernon for 8.5 years during the Revolutionary War. He never went home. He was always in the war. And even while he was President of the United States for 8 years, he was only at Mount Vernon 10 times during those 8 years. And after this presidency, of course, he soon died. So he gave up quite a bit to be the President of the United States. There were other things that impressed me about our visit to Mount Vernon. One was the reminder that our revolution was a revolution against a king. George Washington, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, led a fight for independence from a king whom the signers of the Declaration of Independence stated had a, quote, history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over the states, unquote. Those were our revolutionary founders talking. And as president of the Philadelphia Convention, George Washington presided over the writing of the United States Constitution, which emphasizes, if it emphasizes any one word, the idea of liberty in creating the system of government that we enjoy today. And then there was another aspect to George Washington of which we were reminded, which would be good for us to think about today, and that was his modesty and restraint. George Washington must have had remarkable presence. He never had to say very much, apparently, to command the attention and respect of his countrymen. He likely could have been general of the army as long as he wished and president of the United States as long as he wished. But he chose not to do that. It was he who first asked to be called simply Mr. President instead of some grand title. It was Washington who gave up his commission when the war was over. And it was Washington who stepped down after 2 terms and went home to Mount Vernon. In fact, that aspect of his character was imprinted upon the American character. That aspect of modesty and restraint on the part of the executive branch, and a recognition that our system depends absolutely on checks and balances. I'm struck by that attitude and the different attitude that I see in the administration of President Obama today, which has shown really disregard for those checks and balances and those limits on presidential power that our founders and George Washington felt were so important. This administration over 3 years has been arrogating more power to the executive branch of government and upsetting the delicate branch which the founders created for the purpose of what? For the purpose of guaranteeing to each of us as individuals the maximum amount of liberty. I remember Senator Byrd saying time and time again that the purpose of the United States Senate, more than anything else, was a restraint upon the tyranny of the executive branch of government. That is our purpose as a Senate. This president's executive excesses are illustrated, and they were first, by the creation of more czars than the Romanovs had. Now, we've always had some so-called czars in the White House, the drug czar, for example. But now we have 36 of them. And these czars duplicate and dilute responsibilities of cabinet members. They make it harder for the elected people, us, to have a supervisory role over exactly what they're doing. It's not only anti-democratic, it's a poor way to manage the government. And equally disturbing to me has been this administration's use of regulation and litigation to bypass the Congress and the will of the people when the Congress have a different point of view. For example, the President's appointees at the National Labor Relations Board in their decision in the Boeing case, which has now been apparently resolved, but which was an enormous abuse of power, in my opinion. And then the President is taking to blaming almost everyone for the problems that we see in our lives today. First, it was President Bush. Then it was the banks. Then it was business. Then it was the insurance company. Then it was Wall Street. Then it was 1% of us. And now it's the United States Congress, which, of course, is primarily run in a government that is primarily run by the President's own political party. And the President has taken to saying in his campaign speeches, in his State of the Union address the other day, if Congress won't act, I will. And he's begun to show that that's no idle threat, because now on top of those National Labor Relations Board actions, we have the implementation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in a way that's completely unaccountable to members of Congress for the spending. The checks and balances that were placed in our Constitution and that George Washington so respected are being eroded by the actions of this administration. And this Senate has always been the place, whether it was the Democratic Senate arguing about the appropriateness of President Bush using war powers, this Senate has always been the place that has insisted upon checks and balances and the liberty of the people as guaranteed by those checks and balances. Most recently, the President has shown disregard for possibly the best and most important role of the Senate, at least it's the best known, and that is its power of advice and consent of executive and judicial nominations as outlined in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. These actions, 4 appointments, during a period of time when the Senate, in my opinion, was not in session, was in session, fly in the face of the principle of separation of powers, the concepts of checks and balances against an imperial president. Now let's look for a moment at the history and precedent that had to do with the appointment of these 4 individuals. The exact length is not defined in the Constitution, but according to the Congressional Research Service, quote, it appears that no president, at least in the modern era, has made an intra-session recess appointment during a recess of less than 10 days. Both parties have relied upon the adjournment clause in Article 1 of the Constitution to argue that the absolute minimum recess period would conceivably be 3 days. To be more specific, as of January of this year, January 23rd, President Obama had made 32 recess appointments, all to full-time positions. At the same point in time in his first term, President Clinton had made 9 recess appointments to full-time positions. President Bush, at about the same time, had made 35. So they all made recess appointments while the Senate was in recess. That's provided for specifically in the Constitution as something the President could do. But President Clinton never did it when the Congress was in session for less than 10 days. President Bush never did it when Congress was in recess for shorter than 11 days. And President Obama did it when we were in a period of less than 3 days. Why is that important? Well, in 2007, the current majority leader of the United States Senate, Harry Reid, decided that the Senate did not want President Bush making recess appointments. That is, making appointments while the Senate wasn't in session. So they refused, the Senate did at that time, to enter into prolonged recesses. They invented the idea of pro forma recesses every 3 days. President Bush strenuously objected to that, but he respected that. He respected the constitutional authority of the Senate under Article 1, Section 5, to determine when the Senate is in session. On November 16, 2007, Senator Reid said, quote, with a Thanksgiving break looming, this is Senator Reid, the administration has informed me that they would make several recess appointments. Now, Senator Reid didn't like the idea of recess appointments any more than we do. So he said, As a result, I am keeping the Senate in pro forma to prevent recess appointments until we get this back on
Has
track.
consumed 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Would you please let me know when I consume 3 more? On November 16th, Senator Reid said, as a result, I'm keeping the Senate in pro forma to prevent recess appointments until we get the process back on track. We don't need a vote in recess. We'll just be in pro forma session. We will tell the House to do the same thing. Well, Mr. President, the President is restricted, as Senator Reid indicated, by Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, which states that neither House during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, nor to any other place than that in which the 2 houses shall be sitting. Last December, when the House and Senate agreed to adjourn, the Speaker, a Republican, and the Majority Leader here, a Democrat, agreed the 2 chambers were not going to recess, but would hold pro forma sessions for the express purpose of not going into recess, yet the President went ahead and made his appointments. This is a dangerous trend. It's a dangerous trend. The major issue before our country is the Obama economy. That is what we'll be talking about more than anything else in an election year. But liberty is also important in our country. And if the President's current actions were to stand as a precedent, the Senate may very well find that when it takes a break for lunch, when it comes back, the country has a new Supreme Court justice. Because we believe in the importance of that constitutional system, all of us on the Republican side insist on a full and complete debate on this issue. We intend to take this issue to the American people. We will file amicus curiae briefs in all of the appropriate courts, and we will take this issue to the most important court in the land, and that is the court of the American people on Election Day. I don't suggest that the President will find or even should find his relationship with Congress to be easy or simple. George Washington didn't. President Washington once came up here to discuss a treaty with senators and became so angry that he said, and these are Washington words, "I'll be damned if I go there again." Well, the separations of powers does not mean an easy distribution of powers, but it is essential to the American character. We should remember that. A short trip to Mount Vernon would remind us of that. The President's recess appointments not only show disregard for the Constitution, they show disregard for every individual American who chooses liberty over tyranny, president over king. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.